Welcome back to this second installment of Between the Frames. Here we're going to cover some nuanced additions to the production process. If you'd like to hear the nuanced discussion about the pre-production process, you can go back to the first episode of Between the Frames, which follows episode 5 of Make This Movie. Here we're going to talk about production, though. We've already covered pre. And we've just wrapped up that production section in Make This Movie with our last 2 episodes. Again, these Between the Frames episodes are a little less formalized, just me solo riffing on some extra production-related topics and tools that I think will be helpful for you if you're setting out to make your own film. In this segment, the specific topics we're going to look at are filmmaking as jazz, and with that, improvisation. Also, knowing your actors personally, asking for input, self-care, problem-solving/conflict resolution, and finally, being present. Now, I know these topics can sound a little like self-helpy, and I can assure you that while in some cases there are those aspects to them, they really, really do have practical and functional effects on on-set dynamics and on production, and there are some practical tips being applied to each of them. So I highly, highly recommend at least giving them a shot. Now, you should know that the topics explored here are also very director-centric. On set, that was my primary point of view. I mostly delegated the other jobs, at least as much as I could. So it stands to reason these will be my main focal points. That doesn't mean they won't be of interest to other members of a set, but be aware that that's where I'm coming from here. Some of them are also very specific to me and my approach. So take what you want, leave the rest behind. But if you're interested in a directorial perspective that may, differ from your own, do yourself a favor and listen to the whole thing. You may find some gems you weren't expecting. And as always, check out showhawk.com/makethismovie if you haven't already for our ongoing micro-budget filmmaking toolkit, where we're mapping out guides for actually executing each phase of filmmaking based on each episode. It includes relevant tools, listed out guides, resources, pretty linearly, and documents for you to use on your own that are relevant to producing your film. Again, that's showhawk.com/makethismovie, SHOHAWK.com/makethismovie. We've gotten great feedback on it so far, so also feel free to send us yours. We'd love to hear it. And on that topic, lastly, I would really, really appreciate if you are enjoying this podcast, if you're finding it helpful, or even if you're not. I would appreciate you leaving a comment or a rating wherever you're listening to the podcast, be it on Apple Podcasts or on our website or somewhere else. Leave us a comment or a rating or both, just letting us know how you're feeling about it. It helps the podcast spread around the filmmaking community. We really want other people to find this and benefit from it, hopefully. Other people who like the same stuff as we do. So feel free to leave that comment if you have a couple seconds. It goes a long way. All that said, at the end of this episode, I will also drop in a couple helpful tools and resources for your production process that will additionally be listed in the show notes and linked to. So, with that, let's dive right in to the specific topics that we're going to cover. First, we are looking at filmmaking as jazz. What does that mean? Well, I'm a big music fan, and particularly, I am a really big jazz fan. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about jazz is jazz bands often are a collection of highly apt and talented musicians who understand the fundamentals of their instruments at a very, very deep and studied level. They collectivize on a stage. They begin with a familiar song, playing to a familiar rhythm that they all know. And as that piece continues and goes along, riffs happen, improvisations happen, changes happen. They go off book. And they have to do so in synergy, in a way where each party involved can keep the rhythm, can understand what the others are doing, while also playing between the notes and between the beats. And everybody has to be perfectly synchronized for this to work well. It's really remarkable. It's really incredible. If you've ever seen live jazz, you know what I'm talking about. Even if the music doesn't resonate with you, you can feel the energy. That said, filmmaking as jazz, for me, is a similar concept. It's this idea of a bunch of trained and apt professionals getting together and really relying on one another and trusting one another and believing in one another and flexing their skills and their chops on site and playing within the beats. And to me, this means your crew is your band and your cast is your band. You are a part of a band with this group of people. Each of them has unique talents, whether they be in front of the camera from a performative perspective or behind the camera from a technical perspective, or behind the camera from a more creative perspective. Film is interesting because those things meet. Technicality and creativity collide constantly on a film set. And that's why your film crew and your cast, they're your band. And they each have these unique talents. And it behooves you as the director or producer in some cases, it behooves you to create an environment where each of those unique talents can be explored to their highest level at all times. And that sometimes means going off book. That sometimes means leaving the scene as you thought it would be behind. Sometimes that means making technical decisions that you didn't necessarily plan for and prep. This can manifest in a host of different ways, but it does require a bit of agility. And I thrive on that state of agility. I love it. I I wish I could do it more. On a small budget, it can get out of hand. So you have to really, really manage it. But the main thing that you want to do throughout that process of treating filmmaking as jazz and making these sort of agile decisions and maybe going off the book or changing something or riffing or really putting something in the hands of another collaborator to see, what they think is best or to have them sort of make an improvisational move on their own or take their input and maybe go in a deviating perspective from where you thought you were going. One of the things you really have to keep in mind is you have to know when to keep the rhythm, right? So in a jazz piece, quite often solos from each instrument will happen while the rest of the band is keeping the rhythm. And then it's the responsibility, or rather the play, for the soloist, let's say it's a trumpet soloist or even a drum soloist or a keys soloist. Then it gives that soloist, that musician, the ability to play within the existing beats of the rhythm, but the rest of the band has to be keeping rhythm at that point, or that solo has no foundation. Now, it's not always a hard and fast rule, but it's a really good analogy to think about treating filmmaking like jazz that way. If you decide to do something crazy with the camera, it means that everyone else has to be really, really firmly rooted in what they're doing. It means that you might not have a lot of room for error with your sound person holding a boom mic in a certain way. You have to have communication there so that the sound person can keep the rhythm and the camera person has the room to riff. Maybe you're doing the crazy camera move because you want the actors to be able to improvise a little more. So then that causes even more need for coordination between all parties. So you really have to know who's keeping the rhythm and know when to keep the rhythm. And the other thing on a broader spectrum with keeping rhythm that I think is really, really crucial is understanding that at all times you are serving the story that you're making, right? That is the ultimate rhythm. What does this scene mean? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Where's it going? What's important about this scene? What has to happen within the scene that is important for an audience member? that's keeping the rhythm as well. So you have to keep all those things in mind while you're playing between the beats. And then the other thing is knowing when to solo for yourself and for others. Sometimes a solo is just not necessary. You know, you can't solo on every insert shot that you try to get. Sometimes you can. It depends on the lighting situation and a bunch of other factors, but you really have to know when it's okay to solo, or sometimes it's just a matter of, we got to close the doors on taking input right now because the sun's going down. We got to get these last shots. Sometimes it's really that simple. You have to know when it's appropriate to solo from a technical standpoint and from a creative standpoint. Is this a moment that requires something new and crazy, something to wake up the scene? Is this a moment where I, as the director, really need the input from someone else, or think that there is in fact something missing here, or I'm getting the feeling that others think that there's something missing here that I might be able to probe into and see how we could, up the game a little bit? These are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. When is it appropriate to solo? And finally, to wrap up the filmmaking is jazz analogy, the director is ultimately the band leader. And a band leader, whether you're playing a specific instrument or whether you're just leading the band, that's your instrument. It's important for you to remember that you yourself are responsible for the tone, for the progress, for the movement, for when each party is soloing, for who is keeping rhythm. You are the leader of the band. Don't ever forget that. And it can be the most fulfilling and collaborative process imaginable. But you are still leading a band. It's really, really, really important to keep that at the forefront of your mind. So it stands to reason that after talking about filmmaking as jazz, we would move on to a related topic, which is improvisation. And now I want to preface this. Improvisation in a film depends entirely on the type of film you're making. It's not for everybody. Some people really like the structure of working with scripted material. Some people like a Joe Swanberg, for instance. They seem to love the process of outlining a movie on a single page and then really writing it with the actors as you go along and shoot. I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. Both of these approaches are really interesting to me. And I find a really solid script, to be a good blueprint. And I like to be able to, on set, sort of take the temperature of the room and take the temperature of this scene and give actors the ability to improvise. I'm sure you heard that come up a couple times in those 2 episodes. And the only reason I really kept that in was I wanted to create in the episodes was to let you know as a listener or as a filmmaker that that's just another tool in the toolbox for me. If I feel like something could use a little bit of waking up or something like that. It's something I enjoy. I don't base an entire production around it, though I would like to at some point. I really do think it's a very fun and fruitful process. And I'm always on the hunt for authenticity where I can find it. So the types of filmmaking really dictate whether you're improvising, how much, and how in-depth you want to go into that world. So some important things to consider while improvising, similar to knowing when to keep the rhythm in filmmaking as jazz, it's absolutely imperative to stick to the key plot points and important information. You have to be watching the improvisations to ensure that at some point you have some version of the most important information that needs to come out in a conversation or in a sequence, that you're driving the plot forward with this improvisation. Now, that's something about like improv groups, high-level improvisers, trained, studied improvisers. That's something that they focus on quite heavily. Each improvisation has to in some way heighten the experience from a viewer's perspective. You have to be raising the bar with every new improvisation. That's why improv games like the question game are really fun, where you see improvisational actors having to reply to each person's question with another question. It can often heighten a scenario really quickly. So that's a huge focal point. But really the important thing to bear in mind is do not move on from shooting a sequence, an improv sequence, until you know that you have all of the information necessary to keep the plot moving ahead. At the end of the day, whatever sequence you're working on is more than likely serving a much bigger thing. So keep that in mind. There's a couple different ways that you can use improvisation. These are ways, at least, that I like to use improvisation. The first and probably most obvious one is improvisation for humor. It's much more common, I think, in the world of comedy, at least nowadays, to have improvised films. Actors who are known for improvisation are most often associated with comedies, and quite often associated with like a Judd Apatow type comedy. Some really great improvisers came out of Judd Apatow's sort of, I guess you could almost call it like a mentorship program that he's running at this point, like a career-making program. But a lot of great improvisers came out of that. If you have really quick-witted, inherently funny people, it's sort of a shame to tether them to a script, right? Like, you want to really benefit from their best additions to whatever the sequence or project may be. So that's one of the most obvious applications, is improv for humor. Improv for authenticity is another thing, and this is where I use it quite often. If I'm feeling like a scene is getting stiff, it's just not feeling like it's not selling 100%. Oftentimes, if the scene isn't really landing on set, but the way it might have landed on the page, and it just needs, it's feeling like the lines are being read or just being delivered, a lot of times that's not necessarily the actor's fault. Sometimes things just they don't feel natural when that actor is finally around another actor and they have to deliver the lines. The tone of that other actor's performance, though it might be great, isn't really matching what the actor delivering the lines had kind of envisioned, and it sort of throws off the thing. So I find that a great way to kind of circumvent that or re-inject some authenticity is to just let actors know, feel free to go off script, feel free to go off script, throw them, try something new, throw them a curveball, see what they do. I find that to be really helpful and cool to kind of inject some authenticity. Or, after you do a couple takes and maybe, you got some good ones, you got some usable ones, but it still felt a little stale, or maybe it's just straight up feeling stale and, nobody on set is feeling it. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll just say, let's throw the script out, and you walk in and just start talking, and we'll see what we can do with it. And the byproduct of that is not only do you get a more authentic scene, but we are able to cross the bridge to the third type of improv, which is more of an exercise, which is improv for energy enhancement, waking up the scene. This is another really common place that I tend to use it. Like I said, if it's feeling stale, if it's not reading well, not only just not in an authenticity sense, but also from the perspective of, maybe the jokes aren't landing or the scene is running too long or something like that. And you just want things to either mix it up in the cut or just to get the actor's blood flowing again. If they've just if it's getting to feel like they've kind of done it to death, break it up with an improv take. And who knows, you might be able to use it. But the really important thing to also remember with improvs, particularly if you're working on a scripted film and you have other takes that you're satisfied with, you don't have to use the improvs. It's totally up to you. Sometimes they're just exercises to help sort of perk up the moment, and then you can return to the script. But who knows? You might get something really cool that you didn't anticipate, that you could have never come up with when it was just you and the page, long before anything else. So that's improv. The next thing we're going to talk about is a practice that I have taken to very recently, counterintelligence being the first time. And this practice is called knowing your actors personally. Now, I will grant you, it is not always possible, particularly with people who are going to be on set for a half a day or a few hours. But what I'm talking about here mostly are your key actors, your leads, the people who are really spearheading the film from a performance perspective and really the people who you are going to have to direct the most and collaborate with the most. I've covered this a bit in the Showhawk Toolkit. The book that I read that got me into this, that I'll cover more at the end, is The Friedkin Connection, which is the memoir of director William Friedkin, if you couldn't have guessed. William Friedkin, who directed The Exorcist, French Connection, and one of my all-time favorites, Sorcerer, and more contemporarily directed Bug and Killer Joe, among a few other films. Friedkin's memoir is absolutely outstanding. It's phenomenal. It's a great educational piece, both for his honesty about his follies and his mistakes, and his sort of candid pride over his successes and his seemingly steel-trap memory and his ability to kind of go down memory lane and tell you of the nuanced daily details of what it was like on the set of The Exorcist or Sorcerer or The French Connection. But one thing that he talks about quite a bit is when he talks to his actors before cameras begin to roll, meaning in prep or even in the casting process, he's spending his time getting to know them as people, coming to understand their psychology, really getting a handle on what makes them tick, what gets under their skin, what their background is, on a personal background, what their family life was like, all these things. These are the things that he's really paying attention to, and he's talking very minimally about the script because he cast them for the most part. He knows that they're right for it. So what he's looking for are the tools to communicate with them on a psychological level. And he's a director who doesn't do a lot of takes. So what he's really trying to do is he's trying to dial in how he can get the quickest output for the least amount of input. I found this to be extremely valuable in counterintelligence because obviously time was tight, right? We didn't have time to do a lot of takes. I think there were only a few sequences that we did a lot of takes of. And by a lot, I mean like between 9 and 12. Ordinarily, I would guess our average was 3 to 4. It would be my guess. In any case, oftentimes what I found helpful was being able to approach the actor, not the character. And I did this particularly with Brian and Sheree, who played Abel and Angela, the two protagonists. To get to know Brian, I went to drinks with him. We exchanged some emails. Mostly it was just the time I spent with him, a couple hours I spent with him having drinks and just sort of talking about his life, talking about what his background is. And you can sort of use the script as a launching pad. Like, what actually made you interested in doing this script? And then we could sort of delve into, you know, he mentions this in the episode, so I feel comfortable saying it, but he sort of delved into his past relationships and what his kind of personal life is like in his band that he's been a part of for many years, Blitzentrapper, what it's like to tour all the time. These are the types of things that I can gain an insight into somebody with, and I can kind of bring these things back up, as I did when we hit kind of a sticking point on day 2 of production when Brian had a monologue and he just wasn't really feeling it. And I think that, you know, that there's nothing worse than an actor feeling like they're not giving their all, and then they get caught in their head, and then you kind of feel like, how do we jostle out of here? And what I ended up doing was being able to go back privately, of course, to one of those personal conversations that he and I had and really flesh out, you know, how to bring that into the scene so that his performance could benefit from it in a safe and transparent way, of course. And then how I got to know Sheree was instead of sort of going out to drinks or going to dinner or simply, you know, recommending movies for her to watch, which I did for everybody, but simply recommending movies for her to watch or anything like that, the thing that I ended up offering to do was, hey, let's go to, there's a video store that she lived really close to in Portland that is called Movie Madness. It's an amazing video store, and she lived pretty near to there at the time. She had told me that she, you know, wasn't the biggest cinephile, loved film, but was sort of always educating herself. And so I said, hey, let's go to Movie Madness and look around, and I'll just pull some things off the shelves, rent them for you on my account, and you can take them home and watch them. And then from there, we went for like a really long walk, and we talked, and I got to know her. I got to know her a lot about her work ethic, which is extremely commendable. I mean, she's an extremely hard worker, always has been seemingly. And we just really spent some quality time getting to know each other, and it was a really nice afternoon, a couple hours that we spent. We went and got a bite to eat. And by the end of it, I felt like, I had a good handle on who she was. And in that case, I think what I gained the most from was the work ethic piece of it, and understanding what her professional kind of aptitude was and how much I could throw at her. And both her and Brian had very different styles, and they were both really, that's one of the things that you navigate with actors is actors have multiple styles, and you kind of have to be the go-between and sort of oscillating with them, so you're not directing one actor the same way you're directing the other actor. And in that sense, it's really important to get to know what their psychology is and who they are kind of as people, because it cues you in. You know who you're talking to all of a sudden. You're not painting everyone with the same broad brush. When I would turn from Sheree to Brian, I knew the person that I was talking to. The next topic that I want to cover is asking for input. Now, this one's kind of tricky. I think that in some senses it gets a little stigmatized, especially by, well, I'm just going to say it, more controlling directors, which, I mean, let's be real. All directors are controlling people. Big or small, we all have a bit of a control freak phase within us. We all have a bit of a streak. But some really like chaos more than others, for better or worse. And some really like a clinical approach on set more than others. Therefore, different directors' personalities lend themselves differently or to different opinions on asking for input from those around you. Personally, within reason, I find it extremely valuable. And the only reason that I say within reason is you don't want to look like you're completely insecure, a chicken walking around with its head cut off, and you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing. Ultimately, people are looking to you for direction. So you don't want to look inept, right? But asking for input can create a sense of community among cast and crew. It creates a greater, stronger sense of buy-in. People feel like you trust them. Something that I've noticed as a benefit. So I'm also referring to asking for input from cast and or crew. So let's talk about crew first. So one thing I like to do with crew members, in this case, it was Mike, the DP, Tim, the sound mixer, Dre, co-producer, art director, asking them what's working and not working. And this could be on a break, this could be on lunch, this could be at the beginning of a day and looking back on the previous day, or this could be between shots. If you're getting a sense that maybe they're a little frustrated or agitated or it's not really clicking for them. Asking them, what's working and not working. And it could even lend itself, if you really trust their creative input, or if that's why they're there, it could really lend itself to asking about the scene. What's working or not working about the scene, if we're all feeling it. Of course, do this a little bit removed. Don't necessarily don't put other people on the spot in asking those questions. But that's one really great way to also expedite getting to the best possible quality. It's not just about you seeing it 20 takes later and finally getting what you want. You can really weed through what's working and not working pretty quickly if you start kind of sourcing it from other people. And again, that can be a technical question. What's working about the scene? If you keep running into the same technical issue over and over, the same kind of camera bump or the same boom dipping in, clearly you're repeating the same thing over and over with the expectation that something is going to be different. And a lot of times, you might get it, it just might take a long time. So instead of trying to force it, maybe asking what could we do different, what's working, what's not working, is a really good starting point. And in addition, I like to ask, how could we improve this? If it is working, if it's good, if it's fine, if everybody's liking it, or if really most crucially, if you, the director, are liking it, but you think that maybe there's an intangible something that could even raise the bar. How could we take this from 100 to 150? Bring in other people, particularly if you have the time. Bring in other perspectives. They can really, really benefit the process. And then the other thing to ask crew, and I reference sound specifically because, again, sound is an area that I'm not super accustomed to. Not anywhere near a professional level in terms of my understanding of sound. So sound is the thing where I have to know what I don't know. And I have to be honest with myself and not make assumptions and always check in. That said, in terms of communicating with crew and asking for input, probably the person I did that most with was Tim. And I would recommend you do the same, not necessarily with sound. If you have a great aptitude for the audio world, that might not be your thing. If you are a more actor-centric director, but not necessarily having the highest aptitude for working with the camera, then you might want to do the same with the camera operator. That's just an area that I feel very comfortable with. Highlight the area where you yourself are the most insecure, I guess in this case, the least secure with that facet of the production process. Again, within reason, don't bother them, don't burden them, but really take advantage of having a seasoned professional on your set and, ask them, is there something we can do better? Is this okay? Is this working? What's not working? And I promise that if you chase that down throughout the production, it'll get less and less because your relationship will tighten. You'll be growing your know-how in that arena. So you'll need to know less because you'll already understand more. And that's just sort of the nature of getting that crew input. As far as cast goes, it's very similar. Asking what's not working is key, and not in the way that I just said it, where it sounded like an attack. But, taking a pulse on a scene, if that scene is feeling stiff, or if you can see an actor's really struggling, or they're just not getting in the zone, ask him what's going on. Is there something that I can do to help? Is there something that's kind of off in the environment? Do you need anything that you're not getting? Is this line written correctly? These are the kinds of questions, like really dialing in, getting the actor's input on what's not working and not expecting them to just be able to blow out of the water everything that you expected in the perfect way that you want it, because, hey, that's not always the best way, in my opinion. I like the input of actors. I like the input of collaborators quite a bit. I really enjoy it. I think that that's a great part of the process, but also because, no one's a mind reader, right? No one's a mind reader. They don't know what you want. It's your job to articulate that, but sometimes the best way to find out how to get what you want is to ask them what's not working about what you think would work. And then another thing to check in with your cast about in terms of input is, I like to ask, is this helping? Is what I'm doing helping? Is how I've been directing you, is it working for you? Are you feeling it, or am I just kind of, throwing shit at the Velcro wall to see if it'll stick? You really want to be able to dial in that communication as focused and pointedly as possible. So really checking in and seeing, are my notes landing? Are my directions helping? Are they overwhelming? Are they underwhelming? Are you not getting enough? Are you getting too much? These are really helpful things to understand, especially, again, on a really tight schedule. And then the final kind of piece of input that I like to glean from actors, because I like actors who prepare. I like actors who put time into understanding their character. I try to facilitate that as best as I can by, for instance, I write character backgrounds for a lot of the heavy hitter principal actors. I did that on this film. And quite often I will kind of resort back to those because they end up being a common language between you and the actor. So I'll resort back to them. And if a scene's getting stuck or if it's not quite landing, a lot of times what I might say is, how would your character act? If they let's say an actor is feeling really uncomfortable with the blocking of a scene or with the response to a statement from another character, sometimes what I'll say is, okay, this isn't feeling right for you. So what do you think your character would say? First, I might even start with what would you say? And then if that doesn't sound like what the character would say, then I'd be like, okay, cool. Well, that's a great response. Doesn't really sound like the character. So what do you think your character would say? And that sort of helps them work in a circular way. So getting that kind of, that also for me counts as getting input. It's really something that they're having to draw out of themselves. And I think that that's the important part with all this cast or crew, getting input, getting that level of involvement from someone where they must draw the answers from within themselves. They're going to be that much more attached and involved with the scene than at the end of the day with the film. The next topic I want to cover is self-care. And this is where we make the transition into what sounds really self-helpy, but I really, really want to insist upon the benefits and importance of this. So self-care is crucial, particularly in making a micro-budget feature, but I guess a film of any kind. It's so easy to burn out. It can be so overwhelming, and you can overwork yourself, and you can fall into disrepair and ruin really fast, and you can hit a wall really fast and just feel like you're fucking done. You've got nothing left to give, but you have to. You have to show up. A lot of times this can happen right after production. You've put in all of your adrenaline to get through prep, from script to getting on set and having to function in that environment with all these questions being thrown at you and collaborations you have to do and all this stuff. And by the time it's done, you just want to fall down. And then your adrenaline drops because you got through the hard thing. And you end up losing energy to make the film in post, right? So it's easy to burn out. Sometimes it happens early on, sometimes it happens later on, but it's quite easy. You have to really attend to your energy levels. And to avoid sounding really self-helpy, I'm going to keep this as short and sweet as possible. A few things that I do are I practice intense focus. I try to be as focused as possible on the tasks at hand, not get scattered. I try to stay as focused and attentive as possible to exactly what I'm doing, to who I'm talking to. And that actually, it takes a lot of discipline. And I don't claim to have that discipline, but I certainly claim to try when I'm on set to be as focused as possible on the tasks at hand and not get scattered and not get distracted. And that helps keep energy level up when you're totally tuned in. And at the end of the day, you're quite a bit more tired. I don't think we humans in the modern age are used to being that focused if you really put the attention into being focused all day. And the other thing that I try to do is I try to get to a place of calm before shooting. I try not to, if that means waking up 2 hours before I have to be on set, which is something that I really, really try to make a habit of, is not being in a rush to get to set. I try to be as calm as possible before getting to set, or before beginning photography in a case where, we're shooting at my house. I just try to be as relaxed as I possibly can. That way, I don't get overwhelmed out of the gate by people's questions or concerns or queries or whatever the case may be. I feel like I can take the early stages of production one thing at a time, not acting like the sky is falling. And for me, that's key. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that frantic energy in the room. I would always rather be oddly calm than jarringly up. So I try to get to a place of relaxation and calm before walking into shooting something. And then the final thing I want to cover here with self-care is staying fed and exercised. It's really hard to do, particularly when you're working these really, really long days. Especially if you're someone like me who I exercise fairly regularly, pretty regularly. I go through phases of great discipline with it, but it's always kind of a struggle. I'm not one of those people that really, really, really loves to work out until it's over. And then I'm glad I did it. But sometimes it takes a lot of initiative. So when you work a 12, 13 hour or more day, the last thing you want to do is come home and work out a lot of times. And when you're walking in to a 12 or 13 hour day, the last thing you want to do is wake up extra early to work out, especially when you did one before, the day before. Putting the extra energy into being a bit more disciplined even than ordinary, and keeping my exercise as regular as possible during production helps feed into my energy levels and therefore give me more energy on set, and allows me to feel, I mean, it's as simple as having a clear respiratory system. Like, I feel like when I exercise, because I do a lot more cardio than I do anything else, when I exercise frequently, I breathe better, right? This stands to reason. That kind of is how that works. And that helps on set. That manifests on set. And it allows you a little more mobility on set in a very simple and strange way. So I highly recommend it. And staying fed, keeping nutrients going through your body, keeping your blood sugar up, really, really helps in maintaining good energy levels for the long term and taking care of yourself in production. And I do have another tool related to that at the end of the episode. So next thing I want to talk about is problem solving / conflict resolution. As you know, in the final episode of the production section, we delved deep into the fight that I had with DP Mike Elliott, which was probably the most, I guess we're lucky, it was the most dramatic fight that happened while making Counterintelligence. And we got through it. We got through it within an hour of it happening, and we got through it even more later, which was the recorded version that you listened to. But there are more conflicts than just those outward types of fights. Conflicts of interest happen. Conflicts happen where people start to get tired. Conflicts happen when you reach a location not realizing the sound is really bad and you're trying to suss out whether it's worth staying, and doing so by getting other people's input. And of course, everyone's going to have something different to say. That's a conflict. You know, a conflict is when, again, I've referenced this multiple times, but when a scene isn't working, it's not landing. You've reached a conflict. You've reached a point that you have to navigate that conflict, and you have to do so through communication and resolving that conflict in real time. For any type of conflict, listening is key. That should be objective number one. When you butt up against, let's say, we'll call it a conflict wall, a wall of conflict, the first thing you need to be doing is listening, gathering information on this conflict. And by listening and gathering that information, you are then able to also deconstruct that conflict really quickly based on all of the available information that you can get. And in so doing, you're able to reach a resolve quicker. And also in so doing, in breaking the conflict down, suddenly you're able to weigh the conflicts for their impact on the final film. Mike brought this up a lot. Mike Elliott brought this up a lot in the podcast, or has brought this up a lot. His constant barometer weighing, is this trivial or is this going to fuck up the film? We're all operating on that level. It's not just him. That's sort of what you're doing at every second on a film. So once you've gathered all the information, you're breaking down the conflict as much as possible to the barest components. Then you're able to really weigh that impact. And therefore, you're also able to weigh, like, is this worth me putting a ton of time into? Is this worth me focusing a lot of my mental and emotional energy on? Is this worth me getting frantic about? Or is it really just something pretty trivial that I can kind of handle calmly and brush through really quickly? So that helps quite a bit. And another way to solve a conflict is default to the expertise of others. Just like I said with the sound thing earlier, with asking for input, know what you don't know. If you don't have an answer and it's causing a bit of a problem, default to the person who does. Even if it requires a phone call, if that person's not there, whatever the case may be. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that because it can hold things up. But really being able to default to the greater minds in the room can be quite helpful. And in addition, don't let conflicts fester. I see this happen as much on film sets as I do in my personal life, which is a lot. People have a tendency of letting conflicts fester. They sort of rot in the person's belly for a really, really long time without ever coming out. And I just think that I almost always invariably think that leads to more problems than it can solutions. If you're sensing that there's a conflict, that isn't really coming out, try to draw it out and do it in a mature and peaceable way. And don't let conflicts fester within yourself. If you're feeling that something is wrong and you're just sort of sitting on your hands in an attempt to have it go away or not rock the boat, reconsider. Reconsider how much you think it will rock the boat. Don't let it fester. That turns into resentment, turns into anger. It's not good. I'm going to stop sounding like Yoda, but that's a real thing. And then put front and center in all of this, preserving relationships before all else. That's what you're in the game for here. In terms of, like, why resolve a conflict if you don't want to preserve a relationship? Otherwise, you just let the conflict go forever, right? It wouldn't really matter that much. No. You want to preserve relationships in the long term. Not just tomorrow, not just next shoot week, not just for the next film, but you really want to preserve relationships as long and as strong and as far as possible. So keep that front and center when you're approaching problem solving and conflict resolution. The final thing that I want to talk about is being present. So we're back to kind of the self-helpy vibe. This is a lesson, or a series of lessons, I should say, that I've had to learn the hard way throughout my life, the importance of them. Full disclosure, I went through a very anxiety-ridden period of my life about a year before making Counterintelligence, maybe more. And what I really came away with was I wasn't living in the present. I was constantly thinking about what was coming down the line for my future, what I perceived for my future, what I perceived my past to be, and how that might be affecting my future. But I really wasn't living in the present moment, which in a large way was the catalyst for me just pulling the trigger and going and making Counterintelligence. However, I still had to put an enormous amount of focus into being present on the days as I was embarking upon that process. It required a ton of time and energy and attention to remaining present, to not obsessing over what the next shot is while I'm still on this one, to not obsessing about the next really hard shoot day while I'm in the middle of this one. Staying present, allowing yourself the freedom to both enjoy the great victories that are happening in front of you, enjoy the vision that you've had that's coming to fruition, be grateful, the gratitude that you'll be filled with while you see this is happening. This thing that you wrote down on paper is now coming to life. Enjoy that while it's happening. Don't just save it for memory. Really just take a second and breathe it in. And also, that presence of mind allows you to scrutinize things in real time and catch more and collect more and be able to distinguish more obstacles before they even hit. You catch obstacles more often than not in real life, in interactions and situations. You catch obstacles in the present, not by looking into the future. You catch obstacles by seeing things that are going wrong now, which allows you to anticipate them later. And additionally, don't let struggles marinate too long. This is quite a lot like don't let conflicts fester. But not letting struggles marinate too long means letting them sit without actually addressing them, and just festering and thinking about them without actually addressing them. Give struggles your undivided attention in the moment as they arise. The moment a problem comes up, look it straight in the eyes and deal with it. It takes a lot of discipline because it can be scary and it can be stressful, but you have to do it. And then it's one less thing for you to worry about later in the day. I highly recommend doing that, and that's a part of presence of mind. And also, this I found really helpful. I had planned this from the very beginning. It's a great camaraderie builder, but it can just be a lovely moment. When you're first starting your shoot, you don't always have the time to have a little pep talk or have a sort of come to Jesus moment between everybody where you can sort of get everybody juiced about the project. So one thing that I really wanted to do and did joyfully on the last day of shooting was I scheduled a very specific shot as our final shot, and I knew what that shot would kind of entail. The line had some significance to me. And what I did right before we did that last shot, when I knew that it was our last shot, that we didn't miss anything, we didn't have to go back, was I gathered everyone around and I said, thank you so much for being a part of this. This means the world to me. This is the conclusion of shooting, and I thought we should all enjoy this together. So if you all want to stand around while we film this shot, I think it would be really meaningful. And it happened to be a really serene and beautiful place we were in, and the sun was setting after a really long, warm day. But it was a really beautiful setting, and it was a meaningful moment, and really involving everyone in that process where we were all present. We were all there, focused. When is this going to be it? When's he going to call cut? We did a lot of takes on that one. Part of it was a joke, like we didn't want it to be over, like just keep it going at this point. But that was a really lovely moment where we were all sort of present together. So that was it. Those are all the main topics. Now I'm going to run through some resources, and I'll try to be as quick about this as possible. I know we've run for a bit of time here. So the first resource is a podcast. It's called The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith. I can't recommend this podcast enough. I was running quite a bit while I was working on counterintelligence, both before, during, and after. And I would just listen to this on runs, and I could run forever and listen to this. Jeff Goldsmith sits down with screenwriters, directors, producers, actors on all stripes and types of films, indie, bigger budget, tentpole, whatever. And he sits down with the people involved in creating these visions, and the dude just knows how to ask the right questions. He asks about specific parts of their process, how they work through them. He asks about writer's block. He asks about how they worked out specific sequences or scenes or lines of dialogue, how they came about it, how they collaborate with other people. It is invaluable. I highly recommend it. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith. It's linked in the show notes with the other resources. The next resource is another podcast. It's called The Treatment. Elvis Mitchell, the host, I have been a big fan of him since I was a teenager and just getting into independent film. This is a very creatively centric show. They talk mostly about the creative decisions, but a lot of times you get really interesting insights into what on-set dynamics are like, how directors work with actors, how crew members work with directors, how directors work with crew members. A really good one that I heard fairly recently was Elvis Mitchell interviewed the costume designer for Phantom Thread, and it was fantastic because you got this retrospective look at his collaborations with Paul Thomas Anderson from the beginning of both of their careers. So it's really neat. It's really cool. You get those kinds of unique views into process and into collaboration that can really help inform your dynamics on set with your collaborators. The next is another podcast called The Director's Cut. It is created by the Directors Guild of America, and it generally consists of medium-length interviews with pretty much the top directors out there that are being considered for Directors Guild Awards or are just relevant at the moment of recording. So recently there have been interviews with Darren Aronofsky, with Guillermo del Toro, directors of that caliber and that height of their career, talking very specifically about their craft to directors from a director's perspective. So it's really, really cool. It's very helpful and will probably inspire you for on-set work. The final podcast, before we get into books, the final podcast is Off Camera with Sam Jones. Sam Jones has created a really cool brand of his own, investigating the processes of actors, of directors, of musicians, of artists all across the board, but mostly focused on actors and filmmakers. And he talks to them about their processes, but also gleans some really cool stories from set. In particular, one that I really liked was an interview with Matt Damon, where they talked about the shooting of Contagion with Steven Soderbergh and how they workshopped a particularly complicated scene that really sticks out in the film. It's a really insightful moment of what collaboration can truly look like. So that's just a small example from the huge catalog of Off Camera with Sam Jones. The video versions of previous seasons are also available on Netflix, so it's not just a podcast, and I also recommend checking those out. Now we're going to move on to books, and I want to talk first about probably one of the most important independent filmmaking books written of all time. There's a high likelihood that you have heard of this, and if you haven't, just go out and buy it immediately. It's the independent filmmaker's Bible, essentially. It's called Rebel Without a Crew. It is by famed filmmaker Robert Rodriguez of El Mariachi, Desperado, Sin City, From Dusk Till Dawn, Once Upon a Time in Mexico, and many others. The Faculty. Robert Rodriguez is a renegade filmmaker, still to this day. The man has built an empire unto himself. But this goes back to the very beginning when he made his first film, feature film, El Mariachi, for a legendary $7,000, shot on film, because that was the only option back then, really, for a legendary $7,000 run and gun action flick. Yes, he did it. He wrote a book about how. He made headlines for having done it. He became a legend off that one film, and he wrote an all-encompassing book about it called Rebel Without a Crew. I read this thing like 3 times in high school, and that was before I even knew how to read for fun. So I highly, highly, highly recommend checking out Rebel Without a Crew. It'll definitely get your gears going for making your own film. The next one that I want you to look at, and I want you to look at this one very specifically, is also a book, audio and written book. And I want you to look at it very specifically because it is an awesome exploration of collaboration in the heat of tight deadlines. It is The Daily Show, The Oral History by Chris Smith with the foreword by Jon Stewart. Now, whether you like The Daily Show or not, this book gives an unprecedented and fascinating view of how the show evolved from its beginning and how the many perspectives involved inform that. And that's about all I can say about it. It is a great handbook for running a fluid, creative environment where people are open to give their insights and input, that is also focused, directed, and has to get out in 24 hours. It's really cool. I highly recommend it. The next one that I want to call back to is The Friedkin Connection, a memoir by William Friedkin, which I mentioned before. I was listening to the audiobook version in the early stages of pre-production on counterintelligence. I became obsessed with it. I pretty much marathoned it, and it's not a short book, but I highly, highly recommend this. Is beyond being a great document for film history, it's also just a really insightful education as a filmmaker in an open way from someone who we ordinarily don't have a lot of access to. But he gives us a lot of really cool gems in there that really, really informed how I approached counterintelligence from a directorial perspective. And again, as I said earlier, he is as focused on expounding upon how his successes became successes as he is honest about his faults and his bad decisions. So I highly, highly recommend it. The second to last resource is the last book that I'm going to mention, which is Robert Altman, The Oral Biography by Mitchell Zukoff. This had an outrageously huge impact on me. I've been an Altman fan for the better part of 12 years, but I haven't truly understood what it meant to be on an Altman set until I listened to this book. And it is a compilation, much like the Daily Show book. It is a compilation of actual transcripts of people from the sets, the actors he worked with, the crew members he worked with, the longtime collaborators, his family, his friends outside of film, weighing in on who he was, what he stood for, and how he did what he did so well. And I just found it to be absolutely fascinating. I listened to it twice. It was highly, highly informative, and it really painted what I thought was an almost idyllic picture of how a collaborative film set could not only float, but fly. And the final resource that I want to recommend is an app, and I will close this episode out with something that is a bit self-helpy, but I can't recommend it enough. Even though I am not as regular a user as I once was, it certainly got me through some tough times, and it definitely got me through some tough times making Counterintelligence. I have sworn by this. I've recommended it to probably more people than I've recommended most things to. And from all different kinds of people from all different walks of life, I get pretty rave reviews about this and its impact on their sort of mental and emotional state. The app called Headspace. And it is a mindfulness app. I know to some people it might sound cheesy, but it is a mindfulness app, a meditation app. It has a bunch of different categories, different types of meditations that you can do for stress, for overwhelm, for work, for your personal life, for anxiety, for depression, for anything. And I highly recommend it. If you are in a bind, if you are in a tight spot, then you will find a pack for you. You will find something or a single meditation that will appeal to you and will help you in the moment. Once you get through the basics, I believe you have to pay in to do the expanded packs, but you have to get through some basic ones, which are free first. But once you get past those basics, and if you do decide to pay in, I highly, highly, highly recommend going and trying the Focus pack, which is, I believe, 30 sessions that you do one a day. And they are to enhance your ability to focus on singular tasks. I don't know what else to say. It fucking worked. It worked. It worked really well. It worked freakishly well. I felt like after doing that, I was using more of my brain power than ordinary. And so I recommend it. I stand by it. Definitely check out Headspace if you get a chance. And check out the other resources. They are linked down in the show notes. They will help you get your film made one way or another, and they will definitely help you on set in production. And that is it for this segment of Between the Frames. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of this episode and the previous episodes of Make This Movie and the previous episode of Between the Frames. Stay tuned for the next episode of Make This Movie, where we begin the post-production process. In the meantime, check out showhawk.com/makethismovie for more resources. Don't forget to leave us a comment or a rating. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. While you're there, you could totally leave us a rating or a comment or both if you so choose. Those are easy ways to help spread the word to other listeners who like the same stuff as you. Music for the show comes from our film, Counterintelligence, and was composed by the great Noah Simons, who you can find on SoundCloud or Bandcamp as Larians, Larians, and his band, Male Blonding, on Bandcamp, iTunes, and Spotify. They're super good. Make This Movie is brought to you by Showhawk Media. If you're a filmmaker who wants even more useful info and tools, visit showhawk.com/makethismovie and sign up to access our free micro-budget producer starter kit, including template spreadsheets, documents, and other great stuff we cover throughout this series, ready for you to fill in the blanks. That's showhawk.com/makethismovie. Visit counterflick.com for more information on Counterintelligence, the movie, including fun stuff like our satirical fake news page. Also on Facebook is Counterintelligence, Twitter, and Instagram @Counterflick. I'm Chris Socker. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.